welcome, Ramona. I wish you
Thank you, Thomas.
have a beautiful day. I hear it's cold in Berlin.
Same to you.
Yeah.
Yeah, cold where you are too.
Yes. Let me begin by uh, giving our listeners some ideas about your background and who you are, because we've spent some time together. We've had some crossovers in the past, but we're going to share this with our audience. So you've worked as
Sure.
the COO of the Energy Innovation Hub. And you've been the CEO of the Spring Accelerator. And these are just two positions that you've had in the past. Before that, obviously, you had a long history in innovation and building things. And at the moment, you're focusing your talent and your attention, your money on the big issues, on bringing together people around the SDG 17, to be precise. In SDG 17, saying create collaboration around the SDGs themselves and making them work. And since today we're talking about your vision, your idea about what a good future looks like, I would like to start with one question that I keep coming back to, which is around energy. We will need to run this brave, wonderful future that we are building. How are we going to run it? And from that, I would like to branch out into all of the domains of life. How does it look? What do we run with the energy? What do we run with transport and housing, etc.? So, yeah, I'd like to hear something about your ideas around that. What do you think?
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. This is so much fun to do on a Sunday morning, to create the future that we're going to have, hopefully a glorious one. So on the energy topic, part of the reason I became interested in energy is that energy was once described to me as the fundamental unit of being able to do work. And that doesn't just mean a job, that actually means creating anything at all, creating life, creating business, creating the environment around us. We all need energy. Unfortunately, for the planet and for people, we've been too dependent on fossil fuels for the last couple hundred years. But we're reaching, I think, a very healthy tipping point where there is no good argument remaining why renewables cannot be the backbone of our energy future. And that's good for several reasons. It's obviously good environmentally, but it's also good developmentally, because in most of the world where renewables are plentiful and oil and gas are expensive and scarce, those are actually the areas that require energy more than anywhere else. It's also good from a gender perspective, and people always wonder why I say that, but actually the burden of obtaining sufficient energy and the financial burden, the time burden that places on households in much of the world is actually borne by women and by children. So the moment that you remove that barrier, which is, actually artificial to that, is the moment when you actually end up with a more productive society, a fairer society, a more just society. So all around, I think renewable energy is a brilliant way of achieving a number of things at once, economically, socially, and environmentally. I think the second reason why I'm very excited about the future of energy is that it allows us for the first time to actually share. Much of the infrastructure that has been built on a kind of transmission model, where you assume that energy is being generated centrally and then taken as far out as you can get and then dropped into individual households or buildings, and that's that. Whereas actually a number of the new energy technologies that have come along, whether it's on a grid or for off-grid and microgrid, actually allow you to share and trade energy. So energy not only becomes something that is plentiful and abundant, but also becomes something that is within your control. And I hope that will also make far more people aware of the energy they use, where energy comes from, and how important it is, but also how important it is to to use just as much as you need and not necessarily more. Because even though renewables are plentiful and could be near free, there's still no reason to use more than you need. So hopefully in the future, energy is not only abundant, fair, accessible, and clean, but it's also a much more visible part of our everyday lives.
What I'm hearing points towards a different ownership of the energy production. How's that in the future, you see? Do we have, because at the moment ownership of energy is very centralized. Maybe that's good, maybe that's not, I don't know. But what's your take on the ownership of the energy production in the future? Who owns it?
It's a good question. It depends on where you are. So I would say that in many so-called developed countries where there is a grid and there is a national utility or a regulated utility setup, that is true. It is highly centralized. The means of production and distribution are centralized. Although in many countries those have been decoupled from each other in an attempt to create a sort of more functioning market, whatever that means. But actually, in a lot of the world, energy creation is extremely local. So I watched a number of people in Ethiopia walking up a hill carrying firewood on their backs. For them, energy is entirely personal. So I think that the good part actually relies somewhere in the middle. You do need some coordination function of the necessary infrastructure, but what you need is for the consumer or user base to be active participants and active voices in the generation and production and sharing of this energy. What I'm not so bothered about the ownership of the assets. I'm much more concerned about the ability to access the means of production and distribution, which only becomes possible when you have what are known, again, in many developed worlds as prosumers, people who actually generate their own energy, pass it back to the grid. So for the first time, they are both customers and business partners, for example, of a utility. That to me suggests a much more fair and even-handed exchange. So I'm not saying take it all away from the energy majors. I'm saying more force them to make a change that puts energy more in our hands and force them to bring energy where it is required.
In terms of the future, and I'm trying to put myself into a mind where I live in the future you're describing. Energy is not an issue. Energy is around. We have energy, depending on the local needs, some of this energy is produced by a corporation. Some of this energy is produced locally. There are local differences in the way energy is handled, but everybody has enough energy. Is that what I'm hearing? Is that right?
Not only does everyone have enough, but everyone is a much more active participant in energy. I mean, if you think about the fact we have no interaction with our means of production or consumption of energy today, the way in which it gets to our households is pretty much invisible. We only notice when it's cut off from us. And we only, in some markets, switch suppliers when we decide we want a better deal on our energy, or for a very small number of us where we're actively pursuing green energy by default. But we don't really know what that means.
It might become a household chore for, let's say, kids.
More conscious.
Instead of bringing out the trash, you have to adjust the angle of the solar panels. Something like this?
Well, hopefully a lot of that can be done in an automated way. There, you can already manage a lot of the infrastructure on an app on your phone. But all I will say is that energy will become both more available to us as a species, but also more visible and conscious to us. Because I believe things like energy efficiency, even if energy is plentiful and abundant, that doesn't mean that one should necessarily unthinkingly use more than one needs to. And a lot of the energy costs, for example, we're talking here very much about household usage or business usage, but a lot of the energy costs in the economy are actually embedded. So my vision for energy extends beyond generation, transmission, distribution, and consumption into thinking about the whole life costs of objects, cradle to grave, and so on, to really make energy a much more conscious part of everybody's day-to-day life.
So let's imagine how this pans out in the real world, in the everyday life. You said it might be helpful for closing the gender gap. So what does it do? What does it do to relationships? What does it do with to the relationships in partnerships, but also with children? What happens there? How's energy going to affect this?
I mean, where I see the greatest consequence of a better energy future is really, again, in places where economics force poor trade offs. So let me give you an example. In sub Saharan Africa, some estimates have it that in urban slums, people spend up to 40% of their available income on energy. And the energy that they use, for the most part, is dirty. It is insufficient for their needs. It is difficult to obtain, sometimes dangerous. So it's just generally all around terrible. You know, it's very expensive and it's extremely poor quality and it's insufficient. What a supply of abundant clean energy does all of a sudden is it restores a tremendous amount of available resources, time and money, and also dignity to a household, not forcing any member of the household to be responsible for procuring this energy, and also not giving anyone in the household the burden, for example, with dirty cooking, of actually lung and respiratory diseases and shorter lifespans. So what it does to relationships and family is all of a sudden it takes away, in the same way, well, you know, maybe not exactly the same, but if you think about the effect that labor-saving devices had on household burdens, and the structures of households, and also even class in the late 19th, early 20th century, where you suddenly remove the need for women to be at home just tending to the basic needs of a household or having servants if they were wealthy. This is a profound change. And yet I'm not sure that anyone has really looked at energy in that kind of domestic or familial sense. But I see energy and gender equity and sort of family balance, productivity, flourishing as being inextricably intertwined. Most of the analysis out there actually focuses on environmental and climate and economics. Unsurprisingly, there are very few women actually working in energy. So this is part of the reason, and this is why I want far more people to become involved in energy as one of the most fundamental things we
totally
care
agree.
about.
So essentially, you're saying energy is the ultimate household appliance. When we started having washing machines, people didn't have to, or women in that case mostly, didn't have to do the washing by hand anymore, which saved a lot of time and wasn't really comfortable going down to the river and doing the washing or doing it with flowing water. So we have this general purpose household appliance and that in abundance. So what else does it change? I mean, we will run things on that. We will. How do we live in a different way? What about lighting and cooking and all of these? What's your take?
Yep. I mean, I think the biggest difference that we will see living in Western Europe as we do is the effect on transport. We are fortunate enough, you and I, to live in a dense urban center. But actually, as soon as you get outside of a dense urban center where shared public transport is available, people are really reliant on cars currently, which are entirely reliant on fossil fuels. So again, I see one of the biggest impacts of our renewable, abundant energy future, not necessarily being in how a household conducts itself, but on the ability to transport oneself and to access opportunities connections. We can get rid of this false divide between the city and the country if we're able to have, for example, an on-demand fleet of clean electric vehicles available at our disposal at a cost that is extremely competitive, which will definitely happen once we build in the layer of autonomy. So another big part of the clean energy future that I think is very exciting is actually getting rid of a false divide between developing and developed world, between city and country, and actually providing almost unlimited resources for people without the environmental or financial cost currently associated with it. Or the entire embedded energy that exists in each household pretty much having a car.
Every time
we'll look back on
I
this and think we
somehow
were
end up in a
crazy.
discussion around
I hope.
the electric scooters at the moment. I want to ask people, so what about these hunks of metal parked in the street all over? Once we solve that, we can have a discussion about the scooters, because the scooters take away so much less space than those big hunks of metal. But what you said also builds on the fact that we have transport infrastructure. So the vehicles is one thing, but we need the cars. We need the roads to put the vehicles on, and we have them here. We don't have them everywhere in the world, and construction is also a function of energy. The construction industry in Germany is consuming something around 40% of Germany's energy. So there's two topics in here. One is around how do we create transport infrastructure in the future where there is no transport infrastructure at the moment, and generally, how do we start building things in a more energy efficient way? Yeah.
I'll tackle the second one, if I may, because actually some of the most interesting innovations in material science are actually around things like concrete, which is the most energy intensive material in the world. I've become such a geek. I'm not a scientist, but I absolutely love reading about all of the different innovations that take the way things are done today and improve upon them. By a significant margin, what we do today. For example, if you double the lifetime of a concrete building, that takes down significantly the energy burden of the built environment. Secondly, if you use local materials and imitate a lot of local design, for example, in areas of the world like Pakistan, buildings are often built around a courtyard in order to maximize cooling and heat optimally. Instead of building glass skyscrapers that mimic something in New York, which was built for a very different time and place, use local and vernacular architecture. So I don't think the answer is to say to the world, look, you can't build, I'm afraid. Sorry. It's more to make sure that everybody understands first the inherent progress that's being made in material science, and make sure and if possible encourage that through regulatory and other means, the carrot and the stick. And secondly, to go back to a lot of things we already know or should know about optimal building, particularly for a world that's going to be warming by whatever degree. We'll need to return to some of that very, very foundational, quite literally, foundational wisdom around the built environment in order to make sure that we have a sustainable and comfortable
I've seen
infrastructure in the future in the built environment.
A very interesting development around material, as you say, because they are materials that are very good as a carbon sink, like hemp or bamboo. And there are people who have created a material that you can print from hemp. So they can actually start printing hemp-based houses. What are the things that you see happening in the future in regards of building a house? How would that work? How does a family decides they need a new house? How does that work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think here we need to look at as much as innovations in finance as we do innovations in material. So, for example, there are a company called Cemex in Mexico actually began a financial model called Compartimos, which actually allowed people to save for building a house with them. No one had ever done this before, even though it sounds incredibly obvious.
Mm,
Another innovation actually is things like the 3D printed wiki houses, where people are crowd sharing the most energy efficient designs that were previously only available to architects or spec builders. So I think there's a whole range of innovation around housing. Again, though, I'd come back to the conversation as with energy. What this requires is for people to take a far greater sense of ownership of their own energy, of their own domestic housing provision, to educate themselves and to take advantage of what is out there. And it also requires a regulatory environment that permits people to build themselves. So, for example, things like land ownership are non trivial in much of the world. In many parts of the world, there isn't even a land registry to tell you who owns the land or who can build on it. So all of those kind of conditions have to be satisfied before
mm,
people can
mm,
really take
mm, mm,
advantage of the technology innovations. I think people sometimes overfocus a little bit on the exciting stuff in tech, which is very exciting, and then forget about the underlying conditions, finance, regulation,
mm,
land rights that
mhm,
actually, and
mhm,
also fundamentally people's willingness to get off their ass and do stuff in a new way for themselves rather than relying upon someone else or
mhm.
accepting that simply they cannot better
So
themselves,
what
which unfortunately I see
again,
as a big barrier
you're
to
opening
progress in
space for two
some ways. I
questions,
hope we can move that forward.
very interesting ones. One is around how do we organize land ownership? How do we organize being able to obtain land, to document and actually register ownership of land? That's one thing. And then the other one, given that we are not here to talk about how we are going to
Mm-hmm.
create that future, but how that future feels like. Um, what does this human that is willing
Mm-hmm.
to get off her ass and do things? What does this human feel like? What's her education? What's etc. These are yeah. Do you have anything
Mm-hmm.
on these?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are two big questions. So, in the service of looking forward into the future, projecting into the future, let's imagine a person who is empowered, first of all, with all the information that is available about the current status of land. So, for instance, if I walk down my street in Berlin, I'm able to see, without having to look at a specialist app or website or anything else, I'm actually able to see the zoning like in an augmented reality way. The questions, there's a set of small gardens just opposite where I live. I'd love to know, are any of them free? What does the waiting list look like for them? Is there currently any movement to try and build on that land, and can I contribute to a consultation around that land? All of these layers of understanding of our environment in terms of the
Mm,
legal status and the needs of the land should first of all be made available to all citizens. It's not actually all that difficult. To your first question, what technologies will enable it? Land registries exist. They're already digital. They're already online. Obviously, things like public consultations about land already exist. They're already online. It's just about bringing all of these together in a way that is accessible to any citizen, which I think will also be quite motivating. Because then, if a citizen can petition the local authority or anyone else for a change of use
mhm, mhm,
automatically, they can walk past a derelict shop and say, actually, I'd love to try and run a cafe in there, and immediately send a request and then have a discussion or a negotiation on an eye level with the local authority to make this much, much more personal. I'm not sure why this doesn't happen today. It's actually a very obvious and very easy way of bringing together better land use, more transparency around land rights, and
mm,
better engagement. But somehow we didn't set up our public institutions to operate like this. What's interesting is in places, for example, sub-Saharan Africa, where there have not been land registries and there is no tradition of public consultation, this can actually be built from the ground up. So I think we actually need the civil servants in many parts of the world to be incredibly equipped and think about both technology and society far more in their jobs than they do today. Unfortunately, civil servants often tend to come up through an economic or financial route only, and are therefore leaving out a lot of what should be their job. So I think the modern civil servant is actually a key part of all of this
so I envision
future
that as a
I have in
person
mind
who
in order to equip people to interact far more
is
dynamically and
probably
proactively with their environment.
not even T-shaped, but more horizontal, being able to connect many different fields in order to synthesize answers to questions that might have not even been posed, but that could come from any direction. And because that's the second thing I hear is because the people are more or very entrepreneurial. I mean, just popping up a cafe somewhere, that's an entrepreneurial spirit. And building on this, I wonder what a world looks like where everybody can express themselves in such a way. What happens to supply on the one hand, but also what happens to the conversation that we now call politics, which is a part of that. So how does it change? What does it look like in your future?
Mm. I think what it does is it genuinely gives a lot more power to people. And in a way, we see some signs of what this future could look like already around us. So if we look at cities like Detroit that have seen a real resurgence in local entrepreneurship and innovation experimentation, mainly because of the availability of land and the proactivity of getting people in. If we look at what some of the rural villages in Europe have done, selling houses for €1, trying to encourage people to move, doing things like that. I think we can already see that what this does is it actually makes people much, much more creative, and it also makes them much more engaged and willing to contribute because they're able to contribute. I'm a real believer in the human spirit and human ingenuity, but I also believe that, ironically, many of the so-called modern systems that we have get in the way of that. So, for example, I think it's a terrible shame that what our modern welfare system seems to have done is effectively act as a form of basic income, where the tacit bargain is don't look for employment, don't look for occupation, just accept your minimum ability to live and breathe, and we'll leave you in peace, and you do the same for us. I think it's actually a terrible waste of people, their skills, their resources, their interests, and their potential. And yet we seem to accept it as a bargain. And if you go as far as some of the people in Silicon Valley, you assume that is actually a good future. I do not see that as a good future. I think a good future involves people being much, much more engaged in their surroundings, in their environment, in their world than they are today. And what it does for politics is it makes for a much better equipped citizenry. And the ability to be, again, far better involved. This is where I think local and regional politics may end up being more important in some ways than national politics. The irony is you need the global politics to solve some of the global problems, but you actually really need to flourish in local democracy to make for a better existence for people.
As a new profile for a politician, as somebody who connects with as many people and as much information, as many pools of information as possible, in order to get synthesize some coherent idea about the local setup, about the local needs, about the local desires and wishes, etc. And then potentially moves that into a broader discussion on a more global level or national level, if there is something like a nation state in your future. So there's a lot of conversation going on, and there's a lot of entrepreneurship going on, which also means that people have time and resources, because these are the two things required for conversations and for being entrepreneurial. Where do they get their time from in your future?
It's a good question. I mean, I think more people, actually, quite a few people have time today. They just don't necessarily use it in this particular way. So it's amazing to me that the average minutes of television watching or Netflix watching or whatever watching have been going up and up and up, because people feel they don't have time. But in the 168 hours there are in a week, they actually have more leisure time than they ever have had. That's one angle. The other angle is that with the sort of destruction of conventional jobs, there are fewer and fewer people in traditional employment, and therefore many people like me this year who have pockets of time that are unfilled or underutilized. And therefore, it's a bit like Swiss cheese, right? There's going to be these pockets of time where people can have micro engagements. I'm not suggesting that everyone becomes a local community activist.
So
I'm
we would have
suggesting that it will be possible to be an activist
roles,
in 5 minutes a day,
and
which we definitely have.
We would need to be very aware of these multiple roles if we can split them in 5 minute segments. I have gone through phases, and probably will be in phases again, where I split my day in 15-minute chunks. And that is pretty tough. So splitting my day in 5-minute chunks doesn't feel so like a future I want to be part of, to be honest, because I feel like I want to be able to take some of that time to make sense of the world and the input, and then come back and use 5 minutes to say something, maybe, but use 2 hours to think about it first. How does that fit together? I'm aware I did a hyperbole, but yes, go ahead.
No, I completely get it, and I agree that a world where you are optimizing to that relentless degree sounds pretty unappealing. But that's not what I had in mind. What I'm trying to articulate is that if you look at the available amount of time and you use all the technologies that are available and that are becoming increasingly ubiquitous to help channel the things to you that are important to you, it is possible for you to make an impact in very little time. I'm absolutely not saying that the need for deep work will go away. In fact, I think it'll become more important than ever. But imagine if part of people's daily routine, we've heard so much in recent years about how doing small amounts of fitness are really important. What if small amounts of civic engagement were equally important? And what if it were as easy to do something civically engaged as it would be to do a 15-minute yoga workout? That would be absolutely brilliant. We ask people to participate in elections once every few years, and that seems to be the extent of their civic participation, and not even everyone does that. Whereas actually, if you could become involved in small amounts, what you'd have to do in between, though, is you'd have to do a lot of deep work and thinking. You'd have to become much more engaged and aware of the issues, because I think the whole system of understanding the world requires much, much more time and concentration in order to figure out then where you want to put your energy and how to get involved. So imagine a situation where you cycle backwards and forwards between periods of deep work, thinking, reflection, concentration, and small micro engagements where you try and put your energy with a laser-like focus in terms of where it will make the most difference. Because I think otherwise it will become overwhelming as well for people. Where do you start? If you care about energy and the environment and gender and climate and justice and basically all the SDGs, where do you actually start as a human being? I mean, you can buy
the people
reusable
that
grocery
know how
bags
to
and
act
say
that
that's
way, they
it.
need to
But
be
actually, we need to give people the
pretty
ability to make much more of an
balanced
impact
and
than
pretty
that.
solid and stable in themselves on the one hand, but also very flexible to be able to adapt to new circumstances. This means that we have to rebuild the way we educate new humans to make sense of the world. So what does it say for education and school or university systems? How's it,
Definitely.
what does that look like in your
Yep.
future?
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it says a lot. If coming back to our first point, if energy is the ability to do work, education is the ability to figure out what work to do. And I actually think our education system needs a complete overhaul. First of all, it should be lifelong. There's no reason why it shouldn't be today, apart from the way that it's structured. It doesn't actually make sense in 100-year life to only be educated for 20 years of it and then not at all for the rest. That doesn't make any sense. So lifelong learning is a must. Bite-sized learning, I think, is important. The ability to access things fairly quickly, and also an awareness of systems is probably the most important thing on earth to give every school child. Right now, we rotate people through subjects. We force people down a path where they choose one major or one thing. So somehow you're not meant to be interested in the planet you live in unless you've done environmental science, which is nonsense. We're all part of it. So I think the third thing I'd say is the sense-making point that you made, Thomas, is that everyone needs to be, to a degree, a social scientist, to be critical, to be observant, and to be open. And those are skills taught in the social sciences and somehow not taught in the sciences or in the humanities or in lots of other things that govern our world. So I personally find those skills extremely useful. When I'm looking at things like how to shift the finance world in the future, you absolutely do need to be an anthropologist and social psychologist to understand how to do it, not just an economist. So I think the final thing is we need to teach people how to learn. So if people are going to be lifelong learners, then they actually need to learn how to learn, which is harder than it sounds, but a lot of fun once you actually do
there
it. But
is
right
a
now,
massive
learning is
reward
self-taught.
in being a geek like yourself today already. But 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 very often it is in society rewards having,
Thank you.
I don't know, your private jet more than being a geek. But maybe it's more important to be a geek than having a private jet. So what I'm trying to get to is what does the interpersonal incentive system look like that today is geared towards the private jet, but that might be geared towards something else like I don't know, participation, education, whatever, in a future. And that's I'm saying that because that ties back into what you said about the financial system, because the financial system is what's running us to want to have the private jet. So, what's your take?
Mhm. I mean, first of all, I don't think everywhere people have the same ideas of status. I think in many, many parts of the world, individual material status is not necessarily a thing to be desired. If I look at the cultures of Denmark or Japan or Kenya, or actually most of the world apart from Silicon Valley and certain parts of Western Europe, I would argue the value system is not, if you have a private jet, you're a good person. I think the trouble is a lot of what we read suggests that, and therefore we think we should want a private jet in order to be a good person. So I'm sorry for a little bit of sophistry there, but I just don't agree that everyone aspires to the greatest possible individual material supremacy they can. I think the billionaires do, and that's why they're billionaires. I'm not sure that for the rest of us, we really care so much about that. What I would say is there isn't perhaps enough valorizing or glamorizing of the people who are almost the opposite, who are not motivated by finance. I remember having this argument with many fellow leadership team members where they thought incentives were all about material. And actually, when you look at the research and the data on human psychology and motivation, very little of it is actually around extrinsic rewards. People want to be rewarded fairly for their work, for their labor, for their ideas. They don't necessarily want to be rewarded disproportionately. And again, I think it's the exception that wants to be rewarded disproportionately rather than the rule. Somehow we've come to think of it as being the norm, and it's not. I would also point to gender in this, just as if I may, because most men that I know seem to think that this is what they should want. Even if they don't want it. Very few women I know seem to think this is what they should want. I won't go any further than that, but I would say that if half of humanity doesn't want this, and most of the rest of humanity doesn't really want this, and so only a small group of people energy, think they want this, then maybe we're being a little bit sweeping about what we actually value. And that's good, because it means that we don't have as much of a job to shift things
we
as
have,
we think.
in that future, a real gender equity, which then means that the voice and the preference of the feminine can have a positive counterbalance to the masculine that was over enhanced in the last centuries, and so there you create the true balance with that. Yeah, go ahead.
It's not just about gender, if I may interrupt. It's also just making sure that every person's life has value. And women are by no means the only people whose voices have been ignored or excluded. I would say that applies to certain occupations, to race, to even to living in the city or countryside today. So the only reason why sometimes it's talked about as masculine and feminine is because that's how these value systems have been encoded in terms of who has power and who does not. But by no means does every man have power, and by no means does every woman not have it. And I also believe that a lot of traditional masculine values, for example, conservation, or basically wishing to provide, these things are not necessarily allied to this ideology of winner takes all either. Otherwise, you wouldn't find plenty of men in the world who actually have a very different point of view.
Elements of the world that you're describing.
I just wanted to say, I'm not sure it's only about gender. I think it's about social justice.
There seems to be a lot of harmony in there, a lot of balance. And what if that is something like, to paraphrase the Matrix, humans cannot live, don't want, they just cannot bear harmony. Is that how do we manage this? How's that solved in your future?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, some people think that people actually value chaos or war or whatever else. But I mean, I look to people like Ursula K. Le Guin for answers, who is talked about as a science fiction writer, but actually was a builder of worlds. And I think we don't know what level of chaos people want or don't want. We don't really know that. We assume, based on the past, that people, need friction and conflict. But actually, if you look at what that friction and conflict has typically been about, it has been about resources. It has been about scarce, uneven access to resources, or it has been about power. And in the future that I'm describing, we're taking away at least half of the equation. Then the question becomes, is the grasp for power or the lust for power important enough to offset a desire for resourcefulness and abundance? And if so, how's that going to play out? We see it today playing out with a very, very small group of people who try and corral all of the power and resources in terms of money. I have no idea, but I would be willing to guess that perhaps in the future, that kind of behavior might actually be censured by other people, and they might have the means to do it. Right now, you don't have an effective means to counteract. I wouldn't say the taxation system is exactly, a way of censoring behavior. It's not. But in the future, there might very well be a way of social censure to round upon the agent of chaos and say, stop being such a selfish bugger. Just get over yourself. There might even be a sort of form of exile or something for people who refuse to behave in a way that is making a contribution. I have no idea. I'm certainly not pointing us to a world where it's Maoist punishment circles all over the place. But I think we haven't tried what it would be like in a world that has abundant resources before.
Let's say our most comfortable level of chaos versus balance or harmony, and we when we group with other people in the same level. As you said, there might be a place for those people to go. So we group around with people on the same level to then create even more harmony inside of that, because within our nature, we are in harmony or balance within our subjective imbalance, if that makes any sense. But we could and using I'm just trying to build on that picture, but we could use more of the technology to create these types of groups in virtual environments that also allow you to just offload that these parts of your nature and live through those parts of your nature in a safe environment when and before going back to the 3D real world and act as a balanced human. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, interesting. We don't need technology for this, or rather, there's a technology that's existed for hundreds of years. It's called Carnival. And it's a way for ordered societies, to let off steam. It happens in Berlin every New Year's Eve when you have the school teacher and the civil servant lighting off a box of 50 fireworks right under your window. It happens in Venice when people put masks on and go through the street. There are time-honored ways that are essentially human of basically blowing off steam. I don't actually think you need online forums or 3D immersive video games where you blow other people up into smithereens. If I think about the fact that, wars have been declining for many, many years out of this, lack of or reduction of resource scarcity, and of course also the technological advances in warfare, which allow for more precision. But I think people are pretty good at being able to sort of get rid of the rage and the rampage if we need it. I'm not saying there won't be violence. I'm not saying there won't be evil. I think those things are part of human nature, but I think they're a much smaller part than perhaps we give ourselves credit for. If all you have to do is look at the level of violent crime in societies that are more equal, and it becomes apparent that the moment
I've
it's
come
not
across
about
somebody
resources,
who's
there's a lot
to that
less
point once
need
said,
to take
what
out
if
hostility and somehow level the playing field.
the
A lot of violence
granularity
is about
of
that.
the human mind is infinite? Essentially saying the conflicts have been about, as you say, resources. But now there are no needs for resource conflicts anymore, and now we can have conflicts about other more refined stuff. And yeah, maybe that's a way. I don't know. I really like that picture, because that's allows us to have more intellectual and more emotional conflicts on a higher level of being, without the need for having mass in organizations for letting off steam in the form of a carnival or something, which we can do, but maybe we don't even need that anymore, because everybody can do that on their personal level. Okay. So we're in this world. I'm just trying to recap, from trying to draw the picture in my mind, to see what else there might be necessary for building this world. We've talked a little bit about transport, about the fact that we can, with better materials, with better access to energy and energy production, create the required infrastructure for transport everywhere. We've talked about education that allows for continuous lifelong education and systems thinking within that education, helping people to think in entire systems. We've talked about politics, where there are these lateral connectors, integrators that may help towards making sense between the local and the global. We've talked about the declining need for conflict and war. What about food? Food we haven't talked about yet. So how do we nourish ourselves? Where do we get the food? What kind of food do we eat in the future that you see?
I mean, it's a bit like transport. In the future, we'll say to ourselves, did we really use so much of our productive land for so little output? So a combination of science and agrarian improvements will do a great deal. I think, again, with agriculture, we're in a tremendously exciting phase that isn't really understood or visible to many people. I think many people see the sort of shiny end of it, where they see lab-grown meat and they think, great, we can make a burger out of plants and chemicals. Actually, that isn't anything like the most exciting thing happening. To me, a far bigger question and a more important environmental question is actually the question of 30 to 40% of food being wasted. We're not very precise right now in our ability to grow, transport, store, or distribute crops. And I think the increased precision that we will get at every point of that chain will allow us comfortably to feed people, as long as we are using the land in a way that makes sense. And that includes using land like urban farming, vertical farming, city farming, micro farming, allotments. You'll notice, Thomas, in a lot of the things I talk about the future, they also reference the past, because humanity didn't just come into being when Google and Facebook got started. We have a long tradition of figuring out ways to feed ourselves. But we also have, with the benefit of thousands of years of history, we also have this extraordinary time in technology where all of these technologies are combining together to produce the blueprints for abundance. And that is absolutely true in terms of food. I do think, though, the one thing we can't overcome is our nature as bodies. We're
Mm-hmm.
physical, and therefore we need energy, nutrition. And as we get to understand more about that and realize the benefits of things like a plant-based diet, hopefully everyone will come together and realize that what is good for themselves is also good for the world. So we'll have this sort of joint set of progress on the scientific, technological
Okay.
front with agriculture, but also on the
And
nutritional and wellness front with people
with
that will push us in a
so you're
direction
saying
of a
that in a
primarily
world with 10
plant-based
billion
diet, which, by
people,
the way, most of the world
we
knows
can
has known for
actually
thousands of years
feed
is
10
actually the
billion
better way to
people,
go.
because many people doubt that. Hmm. No? Okay.
We could. We could, but I don't think the world is going to have 10 billion people, by the way. Um, if you look at things, yeah, I can hear you. If you actually look at the fact that birth rates have halved or more than halved in most countries where energy and work have become available, um, the people who think that the world is going to be overpopulated have always been with us, and they've never been right. Because actually, what economic development does is it actually takes away the need to have many children as your future insurance policy. It also takes away the need to have many children because you're afraid they will die. And the plummeting of infant mortality in the world is one of the biggest, least well known good news stories we've ever had.
Hmm.
So I actually, first of all, I don't think the world is going to reach 10 billion people. I think we'll stop far short of that. I think the population will actually start declining in 50 years' time for various reasons. We can talk about that on some other podcast. But I also think even if we did, we would be able to feed ourselves as long as
Hmm.
we pursue these twin
Okay.
tracks of plant-based diet
Um,
and extremely effective use of scientific and
so adding
technology
to my
advances in
inner
agriculture.
picture of
And
your
again, I
world,
think regulation
now
can
we
do a
have the
great
food
deal
situation
to
covered.
help us with that.
We're all eating a plant-based diet, and we can we can we can actually pull it off. We could pull it off with 10 billion people probably, but you're saying we're not even getting there. Not even close, and then we're declining over the second half of the century probably. Um, and um, so all of what you describe are massive shifts in the way we organize our world and organize society.
Mm-hmm.
And the core element of society at the moment is the family unit. Um, how does that how
Mm-hmm.
does the family unit
Mm-hmm.
evolve in your future? Is that or what does it look like in your future?
Mm-hmm. What a good question. I think in some ways, the family unit becomes a bit more integrated with community. So I've been watching with interest the development of things like co housing or intentional communities, which are very niche, but I think are growing and growing, which is where people effectively create their own family. We've thought about the nuclear family, or in some cultures, the extended family, as being only related by blood, and that is the family that matters. But I actually believe in the future, the family is going to broaden and be much more enmeshed with the idea of community. So that your family becomes not only the people who are related to you genetically, but also the people who you choose and the people who are around you. So, this idea of a kind of community family is very, very exciting. And I think actually holds the cure to a lot of ills, everything from social isolation
Okay.
to reduced waste to greater civic engagement. A lot of that relies, sort of nests in the heart of that idea of families and communities becoming one.
mm.
It also makes sense, by the way,
So, in much of what you
demographically, if you think
say,
about the fact that the
also
population is becoming older
with construction,
in much of the world,
with in
and
terms of
therefore we will
nutrition,
need to
but
find ways
also
of binding people together
with
who are
in
not
terms of
genetically related to each other.
relationships or communities, families. It sounds like there is a symbiosis between traditions we've had long in the past and new technology and ways of organizing ourselves. Is that a good description? Um,
Hmm.
okay. um,
Hmm.
so I'm thinking what else might be an element
Hmm.
that we have right now
Absolutely.
that
That's exactly it.
we haven't talked about, and one of the things is artistic expression. I think artistic expression um, is a mirror of the time that this artistic expression happens within. Um,
Hmm.
how does art happen in your future? Who creates it? What does it look like?
Hmm. It's an excellent question. And I have to say that, ironically, given that I studied art history as my first degree, the one area that I have not kept up with in the last years, as I've been trying to digest everything happening in science, technology, politics, sociology, and the rest,
Mm-hmm.
has actually been culture. So I'm trying to remedy that wherever I can. But my sense is that the means of production, a bit like energy, of art have been democratized, but that in a funny way, the audience for art has not been. That it remains in many ways an elite and coded pursuit that's become increasingly financialized. So the irony here is that
Mm-hmm.
anyone can now access the means of cultural production, filmmaking, um, or photography, or anything else, but that somehow the distribution and access piece hasn't really been sorted out yet. So it's a puzzling time for culture, and I'm not sure what it means in the future. Apart from the fact that I think we're going to see a shift a little bit further along, where somehow art becomes more um, about expression in a number of different domains. So, for example, far more people will become designers or curators of their built environment. Far more people will become filmmakers, documenting their environment. And I think somehow the
Mm-hmm.
boundary between
Yeah,
art, culture,
I
and
can see that.
society will start to shift a little bit. It just hasn't quite happened yet. Art and culture are still produced by a relatively small number of people, consumed by a relatively small number of people, and not available to the vast majority of people.
um, yeah, we probably don't know
I'm
because
not quite sure how it's going to happen because
it's
I
a
haven't spent as
mixture,
much time thinking
and
about it
as I
as I
said,
should.
maybe a mirror
But there are
of
only so many
what
hours in
happens
the
in that
day,
society, and with technology, because it's also
even for me.
art is also almost always using the newest, latest, cutting edge technology, and we have no idea what that will be, or how the energy will be used, how the technology will be used. Maybe there will be energy art of some form because we can create new things. Yeah, with I don't know.
Mhm.
So okay, so um, for me, this starts creating a coherent picture.
Maybe.
I don't know if is there something you want to add that I haven't asked yet? Something that is really important to you to describe the future that you see, or do you agree that we have a picture? Mhm.
I think we have a picture. I mean, I think the one thing I haven't mentioned perhaps is that I think it is possible, and hopefully probable, that people will actually derive a greater degree of satisfaction from their lives in the future than they do today. Many of the things that cause us dissatisfaction, ill health, um, lack of social connections, dissatisfied aspirations, material sort of culture, many of these things will change in the future. And I believe, I hope, and I believe that that will actually lead to a more satisfied,
Okay.
more
You triggered
energetic,
one more
actually,
thing
population. It's not
by
about
saying health. We haven't
complacency. It's
talked about
actually
health.
about having much
We
more
just
energy
seem to have
to
assumed that
engage,
health
and much more
would
joy
be
generally.
somehow
So I think that's
good,
what I'd say
or
to round
that
out my
the
picture of the
health
future.
system is somehow good. But what does it actually look like? What does health look like in your future?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I mean, health looks a great deal like agriculture in a way, which is we know more, we take more proactive action, but we are also assisted by various technologies, whether it is personalized nutrition available at scale, a better understanding of our genetic inheritance with all of its pluses and minuses. A sustainable transport infrastructure that
Mm-hmm.
allows us to walk, cycle, run, and far fewer cars to contribute
Mm-hmm.
to air pollution. So I think to me, health is sort of the underlying theme of all of this, which is you cannot have personal and planetary health without all of the
Mm-hmm.
changes that we're
Well,
describing. And also, a lot of the last 200 years have been pushing us
yeah,
collectively in a
it
direction
seems to be
of ill
for most
health.
people, but probably that's why we didn't
Ironically,
talk about it,
as economies
because
seem to
it's
develop, they seem to become less
such an
healthy,
important
whereas there is no reason why that should be the
stream of
case.
all of our lives.
So we haven't
Um,
talked about health, but it's very much
but I
something
think
in my mind all the
it
time.
could be similar to what Harari described when we started um,
Mhm.
settling down and started being farmers and growing crops, where we
Mhm.
started eating only one type of crop, which ended in a decline of health. And we
Mhm.
might, but on the other hand, it created new opportunities for societal growth.
Mhm.
So maybe at the moment we're seeing something similar, where at the
Yeah.
expense of our health, we're building the foundations for the
Mhm.
future you were describing. So yeah, I like that. I like that very much. So I
Mhm.
I believe we have painted a good picture, or you have painted a good picture
Yeah.
of your future.
Yeah.
I can totally see that, and maybe in another episode we can start
Hmm.
building on that,
Mhm.
and go deeper also into the questions of how do we actually build this future, because I think that's a very important topic. But I want to thank you for taking this early Sunday morning to have this really courageous conversation about the future, because I think nothing is more
Mhm.
there's no act more courageous than dreaming, and dreaming especially about a
Mhm.
far off future. So thank you for being courageous, and it's been very inspiring. Thank you. And I hope we continue that conversation soon on building your future. Have a, have a great day. See you soon.
No, thank you, Thomas, for having me.
Bye.
It's been great fun.